Hunting of migratory shorebirds in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Is there enough evidence? I am presenting on behalf of a great team of researchers associated with the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, with who we conducted a flyway scale analysis and published it more recently in Biological Conservation. The sky was black with curlew as they flew over the Orielton Causeway, where we would hide to shoot them. These are the haunting words of an elderly local interview in the 1980s, recounting his experience of hunting eastern curlew just outside of Shorebird. So there are two very important facts that are worth bringing to the discussion. The first one is that eastern curlew is no longer hunted in Australia. The second one is that this very species has been in a steep decline since the mid-1990s. So probably in regards to hunting of migratory shorebirds, there is no better species to bring us a cautionary tale than the Eskimo curlew, a species that became extinct and a species for which hunting was very likely the major reason of decline. But now let's go back to the field and let's try to understand why maybe understanding hunting of migratory shorebirds is so difficult. So I have selected some quotes from people who are on the front lines of migratory shorebird conservation across the region. Anything from managers to field biologists to decision makers, policy makers. And this represents 3 quotes of various people from across the region. So it says in relation to hunting, shorebirds are not practically harvested here. I suggest a few thousands may be shot at most annually. Sometimes hunters take large waders or medium-sized waders forming flocks or congregations at autumn migration here. In general, hunting appears not to be of much effect for migratory and breeding wader populations in our region now. And last, occasionally one sees shorebirds caught in nets around fish ponds. Regrettable though this is, it probably doesn't account for many birds per year. So in all those cases, we see 2 commonalities. One is that waders are taken, or shorebirds. And the second one is an underplay of the potential implications of that action. So now let's take, for instance, the case of what one of those persons would be saying in any particular place within the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Most likely would be saying something along the lines of, I have witnessed some hunting here, but I don't believe is important enough or is large enough. And then we move further south, for instance, and we may find another person that tells us the same story. And then a third one further south, and then a fourth one in the terminals of the migration. And then when we start considering that at each of these stages, we may be hypothetically be looking at a 10% level of take of the entire population, we may be actually considering that probably that figure is actually a little bit higher than 10%. So more recently, habitat loss, and understandably, has taken center stage in the understanding of the decline and the steep declines of migratory shorebirds in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. However, the stakes are way too high for us not to look at other potential threats. And since hunting has been on and off as part of the discussion of migratory shorebird conservation in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, we thought it would be very important to consider this issue in its own right. And there are 2 main rationales, so to speak, to consider why. One is that not all shorebirds depend to the same degree on the Yellow Sea, and some of which may actually be declining as well. And second, there might be threats that may be interacting in some ways or being cumulative to habitat loss in the Yellow Sea. So the main aim of this study was to synthesize and analyze the current state of knowledge of hunting of migratory shorebirds in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway to primarily determine the temporal, spatial, and taxonomic extent of hunting and the potential population level effects of hunting. So I just want to emphasize that we did not collect any data on the ground. We didn't conduct any surveys such as the one that Dean Lee just presented to us. All what we did was to do an analysis of the current state of knowledge. So basically what has been published up to now, what is available up to now, and how we can generate knowledge from those pieces of evidence, almost as putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, basically. So we initially identify various sources, or all the potential sources of containing evidence of hunting anywhere within the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. We did not limit this identification of sources to any temporal range. We went as far back as we could. And we started by identifying key references and working from there using snowballing. We also consulted with various experts from across the region and conducted thorough data searches on databases. Then we extracted key variables associated with those hunting records, such as where hunting has taken place, when, the species being taken, and the hunting level. So basically how many individuals have been taken. And as you can see, this is all extremely basic information that we have up to now, a plethora of those sorts of data, but not put together into a single analysis where we can actually make sense of it ecologically to inform conservation meaningfully. So then last, for the data analysis, we particularly took an emphasis on where hunting is happening, or where actually hunting has happened at some point. And we, in order to establish or to assess how sustainable that hunting has been, we estimated the thresholds for sustainable harvest. And for that, we use potential biological removal, which basically tells us how many individuals we can take out of a population without driving declines. And we did that at 2 points in time, somewhere around the 1980s to 1990s, and somewhere more recently to around 2014. And with that, we were also able to evaluate the proportion of PBR taken, or the population, the potential biological removal from select sites for which we could extract good enough data to conduct that analysis. So first of all, let's have a look at how many references we found. So we found a total of 138 references that have become available through various outlets, anything from books and book chapters all the way to theses. Out of those, we were able to obtain 107, and most of those references containing hunting records were in the form of peer-reviewed journal, newsletters, and technical documents. So most of the references that we were able to identify started emerging really around the early 1980s. So this analysis really starts, this spatial analysis really starts from 1970. So it covers from 1970 to 2017. And it's basically just showing all the spatial distribution of all the various hunting records for which we could get evidence from all those 107 references. And what we have is that 46 species of the 61 that occur in the flyway have been hunted at some point within that time period, within 14 countries, corresponding to 165 geographic reference. So all those black dots represent those geographic reference with associated records of hunting, anywhere from Western Alaska and Northeast Russia, all the way through Kamchatka to the Yellow Sea, part of the mainland Chinese coast all the way to Southeast Asia, including Australia and New Zealand. So something important to understand here is how those records come from different times. So there are some that are a little bit older than others. There are some others that are more recent. So some of the ones that are oldest are the ones from Australia, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, and New Zealand and Japan. Some others are a little bit more recent. That's the case of the Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. And then there are some for which it's actually quite recent, not to say actually current. And that's the case of China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Russia, and the US. And those yellow ones are countries for which we have no data. We have no evidence either way. And something important to understand here is what these boxes are representing. These numbers are actually showing clusters of sites for which we have good data, because very detailed monitoring of hunting was conducted at some point, and those 3 sites coincide more or less sometime between the late 1980s and early 1990s. Number 1 is the Yangtze River Delta. Number 2 is Patani Bay in southern Thailand. Number 3 is West Java. And all those 3 sites are important to keep in the back of our minds as we move forward to the presentation. Those 3 sites actually present data that is very specific at the species level, discloses number of birds taken per year within those time ranges that I provided. So now when we look at and we start actually accounting for how much of the PBR or the sustainable hunting threshold was taken for all those species for which data was available, and also PBR or potential biological removal values were available, what we find is that if we go by the extremes of the upper bound of the hunting take and the lower bound of the potential biological removal, we have that for 2 species, take only from those 3 clusters of sites, and let's remember that it's only 3 clusters, and we are not considering all the other places where hunting may have happened concurrently. We have that for those 2 species, hunting may have accounted for up to a half of what could be sustainably harvested at the time. So the take-home message from this is that hunting has potentially exceeded sustainable thresholds in the past. Then when we look at other proxies to understand how hunting or how a vulnerability to hunting may have been increased over time, we looked at how the potential biological removal of thresholds for sustainable harvest may have changed over time. And when we considered those values for PBR from the past, which coincides more or less with around the late 1980s and more or less now, what we have is that for those 29 taxa for which we were able to calculate these values, 76% of those presented reductions in the values of what can be sustainably harvested. And what this is telling us is that sustainable thresholds have declined. So basically, those arguments when people tell us things like, oh, hunting doesn't happen at the scale that used to happen before, well, the reality is that in some cases, those species, those populations may be more vulnerable, which means that even insignificant or seemingly insignificant levels of take could still be important from a demographic perspective and could still be driving declines. And when we actually open up that black box and we look at individual species, particular species of conservation concern, we look at the reduction of those PBR values, or how much that vulnerability has increased over time to hunting. And for bar-tailed gull, we are talking about 84% reduction, for great knot 86%, and for spoonbill sandpiper, sovereign 91%. And this is probably not something that would surprise us to most of us, because we are all well aware of how hunting actually was one of the reasons why somehow hunting was brought back to the discussion. So now let's go back to the question. Is there enough evidence? Yes, there is, but there is for what? What for? We are considering that the stakes are very high. We need to be very smart about where we focus our attention in order to deploy additional forces, to deploy additional efforts and energy on trying to collect more evidence to inform conservation actions. And when we think about how costly it is to develop a flyway-wide system or monitoring program to understand hunting, we need to be more or less sure that there is enough evidence that tells us that there is good indication that hunting may be a problem, therefore better understand it could help us potentially to mitigate it. And in the case of hunting, yes, there is enough evidence to justify the establishment of a flyway-wide monitoring system because past levels of take are likely to have been unsustainable. Hunting still occurs, as Dean Lee just presented, and current thresholds for sustainable harvest have become lower than they were in the past, which means that even seemingly low hunting levels may still be driving population declines. And with that, I would like to acknowledge, various sources of funding and institutional support, and many people. This was a huge effort and wouldn't have been possible without the participation of many people from across the Flyway. Thank you very much.